The quiet calm of a Texas summer afternoon was shattered on August 2nd, 1997, when a passerby stumbled upon a gruesome find on the east side of Lake Arlington. There, near the water's edge, lay the decomposed body of an unknown man. Authorities were called, and a baffling mystery began that endures to this day. The victim was a white male, estimated to be between 40 and 55 years old, and around 5'10". Forensic analysis suggested he had been deceased for about 1 to 2 months, likely since June or July of 1997. There were no signs of any acute injuries, and the medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death from the remains. Found in a relatively remote spot by the lake, this John Doe raised many questions from the start, and his mystery continues on today, nearly 20 years later. The man had medium-length brown hair and was discovered wearing casual summer attire. He was dressed in cut-off Wrangler denim shorts, white Converse sneakers with red trim, and a pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses. Along with his clothing, several personal items were recovered, which could serve to identify who this man is. These included a silver-colored necklace, a lighter, a folding pocket knife, a purple comb, and a gold-toned token emblazoned with a riverboat and the words, "No cash value." Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any photographs of these items online on Name Us or on any other sources. This is, of course, a bit of an issue since silver-colored necklace doesn't serve to narrow things down very much. At any rate, these belongings painted a rough sketch of his life, at least to those investigators who were able to view them directly. Notably, the token was what has been described as a generic arcade or casino token. Investigators checked its origin, but that went nowhere since such tokens were mass-produced. Personally, though, without seeing the token itself, I'd be wary of any such conclusion, and I suspect there may have been some minor distinctions added that could be a clue. Despite the evidence recovered, nothing found with the body gave away the man's identity. Unfortunately, he carried no wallet, no identification, and no other forms of identifying paperwork. Authorities released a forensic sketch as well, which is quite distinctive, but this too led to nothing. Notably, his fingerprints were taken, but they didn't match any entries in law enforcement databases. Dental records were also compared against missing persons reports, with no success. Years later, a DNA profile was eventually obtained from his remains and uploaded to national databases, but as yet, it returned no matches either. It quickly became clear that this case wasn't about to be cracked with 90s forensic technology, so detectives looked at the context in which he was found. He was on an isolated patch of shoreline littered with empty bottles and trash, and there was evidence it was a local party spot. This environmental clue hinted that he might have been there socializing or camping, but the cops were unable to find any abandoned campsite that might have been his. That said, this isn't necessarily unusual given the post-mortem interval on this case, and any number of factors could have led to his camp being taken down within that interval. Unfortunately, despite police requests, no witnesses ever came forward to say they saw a stranger in the area in the relevant time period. That said, investigators didn't find his body until months later, and of course memories had already begun to fade at that point. With each avenue turning up empty, the case went cold. In the absence of answers, several theories have been put forward about who this man was and how he perished. One theory is that he was a transient or homeless drifter who lived off the grid. Perhaps he had no fixed home and moved from place to place, which would explain why no missing person report ever matched him. He might not have had close family in touch, or those who knew him didn't realize he was missing. However, running against the homeless theory is that he wasn't dressed in the layered style that homeless people generally adopt, so they can carry their entire wardrobe with them. Another possibility is that his death was a misadventure or a simple accident. He could have been fishing or drinking by the water and ended up drowning or suffering a fatal fall or medical emergency. The fact that the area appeared to be a party spot supports this idea. He might have been out there with others late at night, and something went wrong. If he was intoxicated or unwell and collapsed, the people with him might have panicked and left him, especially if they were afraid of legal trouble. Notably, under this theory, both the John Doe and the other people involved may have been partaking in less than legitimate pharmaceuticals. An accident in such a secluded area could easily go unreported and undocumented under these circumstances. There is also the theory of foul play, though evidence for this is limited. The remote location raises the question of whether someone could have slain him elsewhere and dumped his body by the lake to avoid detection. However, without obvious trauma on the remains, there's no clear indication of this actually happening. That said, it's possible he was suffocated, something that wouldn't necessarily leave a mark on bones. But again, this is purely speculative. Investigators didn't have enough information to label the case as foul play, so it remains classified as an unexplained event. As of 2025, this John Doe, found on the shores of Lake Arlington, is still unidentified. However, forensic science is advancing rapidly, and there's hope that forensic genetic genealogy can finally crack the mystery of his identity. From there, the cops will theoretically be able to build out the last days, weeks, and months of his life and determine what actually happened to him. In July 1971, two boys walking near Route 99 in Woodstock, Maryland, found a woman clinging to life in a wooded field off a dirt road. She was unconscious, badly sunburned, and had no identification on her whatsoever. Rescuers rushed her to a Baltimore hospital, where doctors performed emergency brain surgery in an attempt to save her life, but she never regained consciousness to tell anyone who she was. She perished about 2 months later, on what would have been her 47th birthday, her name still unknown. The medical examiner determined that a violent blow to her abdomen had caused a fatal stroke, so her death was ruled a slaying. For more than 50 years, the mystery of the Woodstock Jane Doe remained completely unsolved. Police periodically revisited the case, but every effort to identify the woman fell short. Investigators even circulated sketches of her face in newspapers, but nobody recognized her. Finally, in 2024, Howard County investigators turned to advanced forensic technology to crack the case and referred the case to Othram. Othram is a forensic genetic genealogy company that has been on an absolute tear in the last number of years, helping solve cold cases. Genetic genealogy led to an elderly man in Ohio named Charles Sharkey, who turned out to be a very close relative of the mystery woman. In fact, further testing revealed Charles was her son. Armed with this discovery, detectives located another potential relative, Charles's older sister, Mildred Cantwell, living in Illinois. In September 2025, 54 years after the woman's death, authorities announced that the Jane Doe had been identified as Sarah Bell Sharkey. She was a Pennsylvania native who had taken the last name Sharkey after marriage in the 1940s. It was an astonishing twist. The victim not only got her name back, but also had 2 children still alive to learn the truth. Sharkey was the 47-year-old mother of 2 who had vanished from her children's lives in the mid-20th century, only to be found brutally assaulted in Maryland years later. Solving Sarah Sharkey's identity also brought about an unexpected family reunion. As children, Charles and Mildred had been placed in an orphanage and adopted into different families, losing track of each other and of their mother entirely. The siblings had been separated since the early 1950s, and hadn't seen one another since childhood. Since they were so young when they were split up, they only had vague memories of one another, and they never knew what happened to their biological mother. In fact, both Charles and Mildred had spent significant portions of their life trying to piece together their own personal history. That all changed when 70 years apart, the brother and sister were put back in touch by the cold case detectives. The two began speaking on the phone nearly every day and planned to meet in person for the first time in nearly 70 years. They expressed relief at finally learning their mother's fate and an overwhelming sense of joy at finding each other again. Charles said he had believed he would never reconnect with his family, and Mildred said knowing the truth about her mother gave her long-awaited peace. But of course, this is a series on unsolved mysteries, and the obvious question remains here. The investigation has now been reopened into the slaying of Sarah Sharkey, and detectives are working to retrace her last known steps. They know she spent most of her life in Pennsylvania, which makes her presence in rural Howard County in Maryland perplexing. One theory is that she may have traveled to Maryland with someone she knew, and that this person turned violent. The fact that her purse was missing hints at a possible robbery or an assailant's attempt to conceal her identity. Investigators have revealed that they believe she was left in that field on purpose, perhaps dumped there after an assault in a different location. No suspects have been publicly named yet, but knowing Sarah's identity gives police new avenues to explore. They are interviewing any remaining friends, acquaintances, and relatives of Sarah to learn about her life in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Unfortunately, as yet, there's been no photograph released of Sarah to indicate what she looked like. However, a forensic drawing has been released, which the authorities hope will jog someone's memory. Anyway, if you think you recognize this woman, please reach out to the Howard County Cold Case Unit since they're looking to talk to anyone with any potential connections to Sharkey. Hey everyone, Jimmy here, just reminding you to hit the like button and the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership if you want to support my channel further. In the mid-1980s, Japan was a nation at the apex of its economic power. It was a society defined by an almost futuristic blend of technological innovation, social order, and an unparalleled sense of public safety. At the heart of this modern landscape stood the humble vending machine, the Jidohan Baiki, ready to serve any stranger for the right price. And yeah, that's what I wrote while researching this segment while very sleep-deprived at 3 a.m. But I'm keeping it in, and you've all got to deal with it. More than just a convenience, these machines were a cultural touchstone. Numbering over 5 million, they dotted every city block and rural crossroads, offering everything from cold drinks and hot coffee to noodles and flowers. They were symbols of a high-trust, automated, and profoundly safe society. They were unmanned, unvandalized beacons of convenience that millions of people relied on every single day without a second thought. This implicit trust was the bedrock of a simple daily ritual. But in 1985, an unseen predator would weaponize that trust, turning these symbols of convenience into instruments of a terrifying and indiscriminate evil. The story begins on a spring day, April 30th, 1985, in the city of Fukuyama in Hiroshima Prefecture. A man, whose name has been lost to history, approached a vending machine for a drink. Sitting on top of the machine was an unclaimed bottle of Oronamine C, a popular vitamin-fortified, caffeine-laden energy drink. To him, this wasn't suspicious, but rather, it was a stroke of luck. Otsuka Pharmaceutical, the company that produced the drink, was in the middle of a major buy one, get one free promotion to boost sales among a younger demographic. The appearance of an extra bottle would have seemed like a winning ticket, a small welcome gift from someone who wanted to improve the day of a complete stranger. And with that, the man took the bottle and drank it, expecting a boost of energy and likely feeling goodwill towards the person who left it. But what followed wasn't that boost of energy, or even a swift demise, but a slow, inexorable descent into agony. He soon fell ill, but the poison inside him worked with a cruel patience. For an entire month, his body was systematically destroyed from the inside out. He finally succumbed on May 30th, a full 30 days after his fateful encounter with the free drink. The agent of his death was later identified as paraquat dichloride, a potent agricultural herbicide. I'll get into the exact mechanism of this poison shortly, but for now, just imagine your lungs being taken over by endless scar tissue until you literally drown in your own fluids. At the time, no one knew that this horrifying, isolated death was the opening act of a spree that would create one of Japan's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. After the first incident in spring, an eerie silence fell across the nation. For 4 months, the incident in Fukuyama remained an isolated tragedy, unconnected to any larger pattern. The plague returned in September 1985, and it spread with terrifying speed and randomness. On September 5th, a 44-year-old executive named Takashi Sakai drank 2 poisoned vitamin drinks, losing his battle with the poison 6 weeks after. Less than a week after that, the attacks reached the capital, and 52-year-old Haru Otsu picked up a free bottle of Oronamine C. Less than 3 days later, Otsu had perished from the contents of this free drink. Over the course of September, the disturbing incident spread across the entire nation, and there was no discernible pattern to the attacks. They were men and women, young and old, from different professions and social classes. This total randomness shattered any illusion of safety in this high-trust society. Anyone who used a vending machine was a potential target, and the lack of a clear motive made the crimes feel like an act of pure, nihilistic violence. By November 1985, at least 13 people had perished, and dozens more were left seriously ill, suffering lifelong damage. But to fully understand the profound cruelty of these attacks, one must understand the weapon. Paraquat is a commercial herbicide, a mundane chemical used by farmers to control weeds. In the 1980s in Japan, it was dangerously accessible to almost anyone. While purchasers were technically required to demonstrate an agricultural need, the substance could be bought without a formal prescription or identification. The requirement to demonstrate agricultural need was satisfied simply by giving your word that you needed it for pest control. You could simply say that you had a backyard garden that was being overrun with beetles, and next thing you knew, you had your paraquat. You didn't even need a backyard or a garden, and there didn't need to be any beetles. You just had to give your word. After all, in a high-trust society where everyone assumes the best of their fellow citizen, it seemed inconceivable that someone would obtain paraquat to do what the perpetrator did. Notably, the ultimate cause of death is what makes paraquat poisoning uniquely horrific. As I alluded to earlier, it brings on a condition called pulmonary fibrosis. Inside the lungs, the chemical generates an oxygen reaction that causes catastrophic cellular damage, leading to the progressive and irreversible growth of fibrous scar tissue. Paraquat poisoning hijacks the fundamental breathing mechanism and turns it against your body. The soft, pliable tissue of the lungs hardens, making it impossible to expand and contract. Victims find it increasingly difficult to breathe, as if they are slowly being suffocated. In the end, they effectively drown in their own fluids, often fully conscious of their agonizing demise. Simply put, the person who launched this assault against society didn't just want to destroy lives, the perpetrator wanted to inflict maximum suffering doing it. They also wanted to be sure that the people who did survive the poisonous assault would be permanently scarred, literally, for the rest of their lives. For the victims of the vending machine predator, and for the doctors who tried to save them, the most terrible truth was their complete helplessness. There's no antidote for paraquat poisoning, and medical interventions are purely supportive and almost always futile. But with that said, let's get to the manhunt for the perpetrator of this disturbing crime. As the body count rose, a massive police investigation was launched, but it quickly became clear that they were hunting a phantom. The case was a profiler's nightmare, a crime that seemed perfectly designed to defy traditional investigative methods. The perpetrator's randomness was their greatest defense. With no connection between the victims, police could not establish a motive, leaving them with no starting point. The perpetrator was also meticulous in their methods. They chose vending machines in low-traffic areas, ensuring there were never any witnesses to their actions. The technology of the era also worked in their favor. Surveillance cameras were not yet a common feature of the urban landscape, so there was no video evidence to analyze. Most importantly, the perpetrator left nothing behind whatsoever. DNA analysis wasn't yet a tool in the forensic arsenal, but even if it had been, there was nothing to test. With the police investigation at a standstill, the responsibility for public safety shifted dramatically. Unable to catch this silent predator, authorities and corporations were forced to try and prevent the next attack. This led to an unprecedented public safety campaign that transformed the daily life of the nation. Warnings were posted on over 5 million vending machines, a massive logistical undertaking that brought the threat into the public's immediate view. These notices, issued jointly by police, vending machine operators, and soft drink companies, urged the public to adopt a new, defensive position while at these formerly friendly machines. Customers were warned to carefully inspect beverage caps for tampering, to check dispenser slots for any unusual items, and most importantly, to throw away any drinks they found. In the absence of evidence, all that remained was speculation. Criminal psychologists note that poisoners, particularly those who attack anonymously, often fit a specific profile. They tend to be cunning, methodical, and emotionally immature, driven by a deep-seated sense of inadequacy for which they compensate with a desperate need for power and control. Poisoning is the ultimate remote control crime. It allows the perpetrator to feel godlike and omnipotent without the mess of a direct confrontation. Further, the perpetrator's rage is often not directed at a specific individual, but is a nihilistic fury towards existence itself. At the time, Japanese experts offered theories that tried to place the crimes within a national context. A professor of criminal sociology in Tokyo suggested the attacks could be a twisted manifestation of the pressures of Japan's intense and work-oriented society. He speculated that for an individual living under tremendous stress, attacking others indiscriminately could become a disturbed outlet for frustration. Meanwhile, a forensic psychologist who was helping the National Police Agency with the case proposed a more chilling motive at the time. He argued that the perpetrator was likely motivated by the adrenaline rush and the sense of superiority that came from imagining the suffering of their victims. In essence, the perpetrator enjoyed a secret power they held over the lives of complete strangers. Other theories would flourish in the years after the attacks, but I'll get to those in a quick moment. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they had started in late November 1985, and with that, the phantom vanished permanently. In 1986, in direct response to the crisis, the Japanese government took action. It severely restricted the sale of paraquat and mandated that the chemical be reformulated into a less concentrated, less toxic version, even when sold for legitimate usage. One theory surrounding the paraquat poisonings is that they were linked to Yakuza extortion. The logic behind this suspicion rests on how the attacks coincided with Japan's booming beverage industry. During this period, vending machine operators and drink manufacturers were making enormous profits. Organized crime groups had long infiltrated legitimate industries through protection rackets, forcing businesses to pay for quote-unquote safety. In this light, the poisonings may have been a demonstration aimed at beverage companies that resisted such demands. By contaminating products placed on vending machines, the culprit created widespread fear, tarnishing consumer trust, and damaging corporate reputations. The randomness of the victims would have amplified the terror, ensuring maximum pressure on the companies rather than targeting specific individuals. However, no direct evidence ever tied the Yakuza to the paraquat cases, and criminologists note that this doesn't fit the pattern of their crimes. While they're known to engage in corporate manipulation, they generally do so in a discreet way, so as not to involve the authorities. The level of attention and heat that would have been brought from engaging in a mass poisoning event is unprecedented for the Yakuza. Further, and perhaps most importantly, skeptics note that there was a total lack of demands, and no ransom note was ever issued. This suggests the crimes may have instead been the work of a lone poisoner, driven by nihilism rather than profit. However, perhaps the most disturbing theory related to this case has nothing whatsoever to do with a lone nihilist out for revenge against the world. There's the theory that the attacks may have been orchestrated by the North Korean state to inflict terror upon the Japanese populace. Now, those of you who are unfamiliar with this period in history may believe that this is a fringe conspiracy theory with no backing to it whatsoever. Well, that's where you're wrong, because during this time, North Korean agents were literally pulling up in submarines and kidnapping Japanese citizens, amongst other crimes. However, skeptics have a difficult time squaring the poison used with this theory. North Korea has access to much more powerful chemical agents that can guarantee virtually instant results. They claim that had this been a campaign by this state actor, paraquat wouldn't have been used. That said, the counterpoint to this is that North Korean sleeper agents may have simply had to work with the poisons they could obtain locally. The case of the vending machine poisoner remains completely unsolved at this point. No potential perpetrator was ever identified, and the motive remains a subject of speculation. Notably, in 2010, Japan abolished the statute of limitations for severe crimes such as this. However, the abolition of the law isn't retroactive, so even if the poisoner was caught today, they wouldn't be able to be prosecuted criminally. In August 2000, a routine construction dig in Ocala, Florida, turned into a crime scene when workers uncovered a human skeleton hidden inside a red sleeping bag. The remains were buried on Southwest 12th Street, alongside discarded alcohol cans and bottles. It was a shocking find, a makeshift grave in the heart of Marion County, and it marked the beginning of a mystery that endures to this day. This anonymous victim, soon dubbed the Marion County John Doe, has remained unidentified for over 25 years. The Ocala Public Works crew that found the skeleton immediately alerted police. The fact that it was wrapped in a sleeping bag and deliberately covered with soil raised immediate suspicions of foul play. Forensic examination determined the deceased was a white male around 45 to 60 years old and stood about 5'7". He had no identification on him, so examiners had to rely on physical clues. Notably, he was missing most of his teeth and had a distinct gap between his upper front teeth. This unusual dental profile was publicized in case it matched someone's long-lost relative or friend, but no hits have been made so far. The skeleton also showed evidence of past injuries, which the authorities believed could be used to identify the man. Several ribs and the nose had been broken at some point, and a foot bone had a healed fracture. Notably, these injuries were healed, and for the broken nose, it was likely that he had sought medical intervention. Notably, investigators didn't find any evidence of any significant acute trauma on his remains. However, given the clandestine burial, the Ocala Police Department treated the case as a likely slaying right from the start. Along with the bones, detectives collected the man's clothing and belongings for clues. The John Doe was found with multiple layers of clothes on his body, including black sweatpants, blue jeans, and a pair of green sweats. The odd combination of wearing several pairs of pants suggests he may have been living outdoors and carrying his entire wardrobe on his person. If you're a regular viewer of my channel, you'll probably already know this practice is often seen among homeless individuals who wear all their layers both for warmth and convenience. Notably, a generic Wilson wristwatch was still on his wrist, and the red sleeping bag likely served as his bedding. These personal items paint a picture of a man living rough, camping out in an empty lot, or perhaps living out in the woods. Based on the condition of the remains, experts estimated that the man died anywhere from 8 months to 5 years before he was found. In other words, he likely perished sometime in the mid-1990s through late 1999, a massive span of time that gave the perpetrator a huge head start. Whoever buried him in that unused plot managed to keep the secret until development work unearthed it by chance. Notably, DNA analysis, often the trump card in modern cold cases, has been problematic here. No usable DNA profile could be obtained from the remains due to severe degradation. Without a DNA profile, advanced forensic genealogy techniques can't be applied yet to hunt down relatives. Instead, investigators have relied on traditional detective work and public outreach. Over the years, forensic artists created composite images reconstructing the man's face, and these have been circulated through media and police channels. Notably, it's unclear to me if the John Doe's remains have been preserved and sent for modern forensic testing. This would allow the authorities to search the CODIS database at the very least. If successful, this would give the decedent his name back and would serve as a better starting point for actually solving the crime against him as well. Without solid leads, several theories have emerged about who this man was and how he met his end. The prevailing idea is that he was a homeless individual who fell victim to violence. Perhaps he was camping on that property and encountered trouble, such as a robbery or an altercation that turned into something way more serious. The empty liquor bottles at the scene suggest alcohol might have been involved, though given the passage of time, it's possible that these were simply incidental. That said, it's easy to imagine two people drinking together in that secluded spot and a fight breaking out, ending in tragedy. In such a scenario, the assailant may have hastily buried the body to conceal the crime. Another possibility is that the case doesn't actually involve any foul play at all. If the John Doe passed away of an overdose while with companions, those people might have panicked and buried him to avoid legal trouble. Alternatively, he may have simply perished due to natural causes, and the people with him may have done their best to give him a burial with what they had on hand. This could explain the lack of overt trauma on the remains. More speculative ideas have also been floated by amateur sleuths. It does always remain possible that a serial predator targeted this John Doe. Unfortunately, people living on the outskirts of life, like the homeless, are often targeted by these predators simply because in general, no one will notice that they've gone missing. If a homeless person vanishes, they're generally assumed to have moved on to greener pastures, even by their own friends from the streets. Further, even when they're reported missing, generally by other homeless people, the police generally don't sink any investigative efforts into the case. For now, the Marion County John Doe remains nameless, but he's not forgotten. The hope is that one day this man's identity will be restored and the full story of what happened to him will finally come to light. Love's Labour's Won is a Shakespeare play that history forgot, a comedy known only by name, with no surviving script. We don't know much about this piece of Shakespearean lost media, but what we do know provides a few tantalizing clues. The existence of Love's Labour's Won is documented by Shakespeare's contemporaries. The first reference comes from a London writer named Francis Mears. In his survey of Elizabethan literature, Mears praises Shakespeare and lists several of his comedies by name, including Love's Labour's Won. All the other plays Mears mentions are familiar works still performed today, which makes the disappearance of Love's Labour's Won especially intriguing. A second clue surfaced in 1953 when a bookseller discovered a fragment of a 1603 bookseller's inventory. This old list of books includes a number of popular play titles of the day, among them Love's Labour's Lost and Love's Labour's Won. In other words, as of 1603, a play called Love's Labour's Won was apparently available in print, alongside Shakespeare's other works. This strongly suggests the play wasn't just a rumor, but had been written down and sold as a playbook in its time. No copy of Love's Labour's Won is known to survive today. It wasn't included in the first folio of Shakespeare's collected plays in 1623, likely because the editors could not find any manuscript or printed copy of it. Without a text, the story of Love's Labour's Won has been reconstructed through theories. One leading theory is that it was a true lost play, specifically a sequel to Love's Labour's Lost. Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost ends on an unresolved note. The couples part ways for a year instead of celebrating weddings. This unusual ending practically invites a continuation, where the labors of love are finally won after the promised year. Shakespeare might have written a follow-up comedy showing the reunions and romantic resolutions that were deferred in the first play. The title Love's Labour's Won fits perfectly for such a sequel. Notably, while sequels to comedies were rare in that era, this could have been an exception to the general rule. Another possibility is that Love's Labour's Won wasn't an entirely new work at all, but an alternative name for a Shakespearean comedy that does survive. In the Elizabethan era, plays sometimes had a number of different titles that they were known by. For instance, Twelfth Night was also popularly called What You Will during Shakespeare's era. Some scholars suggest that Love's Labour's Won might have been an early title or nickname for another comedy written around the same time. The most popular candidate is Much Ado About Nothing, a play written around 1598 that ends in triumphant pairings and could be seen as Love's Labour's Won by its conclusion. Notably, Much Ado About Nothing was not listed by Mears in 1598, which could make sense if it was referenced under a different title. Another candidate often discussed is The Taming of the Shrew. This comedy existed by the 1590s and was conspicuously absent from Mears's list, which once led to speculation that Love's Labour's Won was referring to the shrew. However, the 1603 inventory later found in 1953 clearly lists The Taming of the Shrew separately from Love's Labour's Won. This implies that they were distinct items one could order, strongly suggesting that they were separate works. A further suggestion is All's Well That Ends Well, a play in which a female protagonist works hard to win over an unwilling man, ultimately roping him into marriage through stalking and deceit. Essentially, according to supporters of this theory, This is love's labor that's eventually won. Yet All's Well is generally thought to have been written a few years after 1598 and has a more dramatic and disturbing tone, making it a much less likely match for the reference. That said, some believe that the title could be intended as a subtle nod to just how disturbing the events of the play are. As evidence for this, the title All's Well That Ends Well also conveys the sense of unease Shakespeare likely intended to instill in the audience at the conclusion of the play. In truth, no existing play can be definitively proven to be Love's Labours Won under another name, so the debate continues. Based on the evidence, the play was probably written in the mid to late 1590s and very likely performed by Shakespeare's company as part of their repertoire. The 1598 and 1603 references indicate it had enough presence and recognition to warrant printing. If a printed edition of Love's Labours Won was indeed published around 1603, no copies survived the following centuries. This isn't surprising, as many publications of that era have been lost, especially if they didn't have large print runs. By the early 1600s, Love's Labours Won may simply have fallen out of use. Without reprints or a place in the first folio, it faded from memory. It's important to remember that many of Shakespeare's works were only preserved due to their inclusion in the first folio. Whatever the case, by the time the first folio was compiled in 1623, it was either not warranted for inclusion or was already a lost work. The mystery of Love's Labours Won highlights how many works of Shakespeare's era have vanished. Historians estimate that less than a fifth of all plays written in Elizabethan England still exist today in any form. The rest survive merely as titles or fragments in records. Even Shakespeare likely had other works that didn't survive, and in this context, Love's Labours Won isn't an anomaly, but part of a larger pattern of literary loss. Yet the idea of a missing Shakespeare play continues to intrigue and inspire, and finding a complete copy could perhaps be the holy grail of lost media. The air in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, was thick and heavy in the pre-dawn hours of June 30th, 1991. It was 3 in the morning, a time when the city that never sleeps takes a moment to grab some shut-eye. For Joe Jones, a private security guard, this was the heart of his shift. He had a monotonous patrol around an abandoned building, a landscape of urban decay that was all too common in New York City at the time. The city was in the grip of a crime wave that felt apocalyptic, and neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy were on the front lines. But even in a place accustomed to violence, what Jones was about to witness would stand out as particularly chilling. His attention was drawn to a man lingering behind the building, his movements secretive and out of place even for that hour. The man was near a large industrial dumpster, and something about his presence set off every alarm in the veteran guard's mind. Jones watched him, the suspicion growing with every passing second. When the man finally noticed he was being observed, he didn't flee immediately. Instead, there was a brief tense interaction before he got into his car and drove away, melting back into the city's labyrinthine streets. But he left behind a scene that felt deeply wrong, and Jones wasn't about to go investigate alone. Trusting his instincts, Jones recruited a friend who happened to be working in the area as well. Together they approached the dumpster with a sense of extreme caution. They began to cautiously sift through the layers of debris inside, not fully sure what they were going to find. And then it happened, and their hands immediately stopped when they saw it. It was a woman's hand, pale and lifeless amidst the garbage in the dumpster. The cops were called, and the woman would soon be identified as Soo-Ya Kim, who just hours prior had been full of life. To understand the depth of the tragedy, you have to understand the life that was stolen. Soo-Ya Kim's story was, in many ways the quintessential American dream. In 1981, she and her husband, Soo-young Kim, married in their native Seoul, South Korea, and soon after made the monumental decision to move to the United States. They arrived in New York City, a place that has long promised a new start and potential wealth to those willing to work hard for it. The Kims began their journey in the bustling, chaotic world of flea markets, honing their business sense and saving every dollar they could. Their hard work paid off, and they eventually achieved their dream of becoming business owners, opening 2 popular clothing stores. As their business grew, so did their family, and Soo-ya and Soo-young had 2 sons, and the family was the center of their world. They eventually moved into a spacious apartment in Queens, a world away from the rundown flea markets where they had started. Just 5 days before she was slain, Soo-ya and Soo-young had celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, a milestone of a life they thought they would share for decades to come. The day Soo-ya Kim disappeared, June 29, 1991, began like any other Saturday. It was an ordinary afternoon, and she left her 2 young sons in the care of their grandmother and set out on a routine shopping trip. It was the kind of mundane task a busy mother and business owner performs without a second thought. But on this day, it was a trip from which she would never return. At 8 p.m., Soo-young came home from work, expecting to find his wife and their home filled with the familiar sounds of life going on as normal. Instead, he was met with an unnerving silence, and Soo-ya wasn't there. He made calls to friends and family members, but no one had seen her and no one knew where she could be. What followed was the longest night of Soo-young's life, a sleepless vigil filled with escalating dread and unanswered questions. The hope that she would walk through the door at any moment slowly eroded, replaced by a terrifying certainty that something was terribly wrong. The next day, his worst fears were realized when he was summoned to the medical examiner's office. There, he was asked to do the unthinkable: identify the body of his wife. The woman he had built a life with, the mother of his children, had been found slain. Her body discarded miles from their Queens home in a part of Brooklyn she had no reason to be in. This geographic disconnect was one of the first and most significant hurdles for investigators. With no known destination for her shopping trip and no clear reason for her presence in Bedford-Stuyvesant, there was no obvious primary crime scene. When detectives from the New York Police Department arrived at the scene, they were confronted with a crime of vicious personal violence. Soo-ya Kim had the clothing removed from her body, and she had been stabbed 9 times. The medical examiner, however, found no evidence of an indecent assault, a crucial detail that complicated any attempt to profile the perpetrator. The crime appeared to have been an act of unrestrained rage towards a woman who had no known enemies. Joe Jones was deemed to be a credible eyewitness, and he provided a description of the suspect and his vehicle, which led to the creation of a police sketch that was circulated to the public. He was a white male with blonde or light brown hair, standing around 5 feet 6 inches, with an average build. And I want you to keep this description in mind, because I'm going to be coming back to it when we discuss theories of the case. But regardless of this starting point, the case went cold, and to understand why, it's perhaps important to realize the magnitude of crime in NYC in 1991. In 1991, New York City recorded over 2,500 slayings, and to put that in perspective, in 2024, this number was just 377. And just to put this a little further into perspective, this was about 7 crimes of the most severe nature, literally each day, every day. To say that detectives were overwhelmed and had little time to dedicate to cases would be a massive understatement. Detectives were assigned an unmanageable number of cases. Forensic labs were severely backlogged, and patrol officers were in a constant state of response. The cops turned to the show Unsolved Mysteries to try to resolve her case, but ultimately, this led to nothing, and the case went cold. Over the years, numerous theories have been proposed on who committed this horrible act to Suya. One of the most prominent theories points to Joel Rifkin, one of New York's most prolific serial predators. Rifkin was active from 1989 to 1993, a timeline that perfectly overlaps with Suya's attack in June 1991. He confessed to taking 17 lives, and his reign of terror haunted the city. However, a closer look at his methods reveals significant contradictions with the facts of the Kim case. Rifkin's victimology was chillingly consistent. He exclusively targeted vulnerable women whose disappearances he believed would go unnoticed or unreported. Suya Kim, a married mother, a respected entrepreneur, and a woman with deep community ties, doesn't fit his victim profile in any way. Furthermore, Rifkin's modus operandi was starkly different, and he took substantial efforts to prevent identification of his victims. Perhaps the most compelling evidence against this theory is Rifkin himself. Upon his capture in 1993, he provided a detailed, exhaustive confession to 17 slayings, even drawing maps to help police locate remains of a large percentage of these victims. He has never mentioned Suya Kim, and no direct evidence links him to the case. Notably, while the forensic sketch might appear to look like Joel Rifkin, since it depicts a white male with light brown hair and glasses, other factors don't add up. Joel Rifkin stands about 6 feet 2 inches tall and had an imposing physical presence. Joe Jones described a short man of average build, and given that he was a security guard used to observing and reporting, I think we can put more weight on his assessment than normal. Some have also found a resemblance between Rex Heuermann and the forensic sketch, but again, like Rifkin, he exclusively targeted marginalized women. Also, again, the physical profile just doesn't fit with Heuermann, since he's even taller and more physically imposing than Rifkin. Personally, I think the most probable explanation is the most chilling one of all. Suya Kim appears to have been the victim of a random violent crime. She was likely a tragic casualty of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, in a city teeming with violence. The perpetrator was likely not an infamous monster with a long list of victims, but an anonymous predator, just one more opportunistic attacker created by the city's chaos. He was a person who, after committing a brutal slaying, was probably able to disappear back into the anonymity of millions. His crime went unsolved because the system designed to catch him was too fractured and overwhelmed to do so. This is, of course, a conclusion that offers no comfort or potential neat resolution. Unfortunately, given the lack of any forensic evidence connected with the attacker, the chances of this cold case being solved anytime soon are slim, barring a confession from the perp himself. Hey everyone, Jimmy here, asking you to hit that hype button and hype up this video. I'm not entirely sure what this does, but apparently it increases the visibility of the video to new and returning viewers, so this would be a huge favor. Also, don't forget to check out my other YouTube channels, Lazy Chill History and Lazy Chill True Crime, for more content. The routine of a cruise ship is a meticulously choreographed performance of comfort and care. For a cabin steward aboard the Mercury in late August 2004, that routine included a small, final touch each evening, placing a fresh chocolate on the pillow of each guest. But for 5 consecutive days, as the ship carved its way through the cold Alaskan waters, the steward performed this ritual in cabin 6064 with a growing sense of dread. The bed was always pristine, the chocolates from the previous night untouched. He knew his passenger, a 40-year-old woman named Marion Carver, was gone. He reported his concerns to his supervisor each day, only to be told to focus on his job and get back to work. No one reported that Marion was gone, at least not immediately, and to this day, her case remains a disturbing cruise ship mystery. Marion Carver was a 40-year-old mother to a 13-year-old daughter living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Described as an independent and sometimes spontaneous woman, she had a background as an investment banker and had attended Harvard. True to her spontaneous spirit, she booked a 7-day Alaskan cruise on the Mercury just 2 days before it was set to sail. On August 27, 2004, she boarded the vessel in Seattle alone, and crucially, she didn't tell another soul that she would be doing it. The official timeline of her presence on the ship is brutally short. A cabin attendant last saw her on the evening of August 28th, only the second day of the voyage, and after that, Marion Carver vanished. Her bed went unused, and she received no room service after the 28th, nor did she use her card for any purchases. The cruise line would later confirm that she never disembarked at any of the scheduled ports of call. For all intents and purposes, after her second night at sea, Marion Carver ceased to exist on the ship. On September 3, 2004, the Mercury completed its journey, docking in Vancouver, British Columbia. To the surprise of no one watching this, Marion Carver didn't disembark. A supervisor instructed the cabin steward to box up her personal belongings left in the cabin. In a shocking breach of protocol and basic human decency, her clothes were reportedly donated to charity, while other personal effects were placed in a storage locker. No missing persons report was filed with the Vancouver police or any other authority. The cruise line made no attempt to contact Marion's family to inquire about her whereabouts or inform them she had not left the ship. The alarm was finally raised weeks later, not from the high seas, but from a phone call on land. Marion's 13-year-old daughter became worried when she couldn't reach her mother for an extended period. She called her grandfather, Kendall Carver, sharing her concern. That call set in motion a search that would consume the rest of Kendall Carver's life. He contacted the Cambridge Police Department in Massachusetts, who opened a missing persons investigation. It took police 3 painstaking weeks to piece together Marion's last known movements, eventually tracing her credit card records to find out where she had went. And just to reiterate, she had never told anyone, not even her daughter, that she was going on this spontaneous cruise. When Kendall Carter finally contacted the cruise line, it was October, and he was met with what he claimed was a wall of indifference. It took the company 3 full days just to confirm that Marion had been a passenger on the Mercury. By that point, 26 days had passed since her disappearance. When a manager finally spoke with him, the explanation was allegedly dismissive. The representative suggested it was normal for passengers to leave belongings behind, and that she may have just walked off the ship undocumented in Vancouver. There was no mention of the cabin steward's 5 days of reports. This response revealed a critical flaw in how incidents at sea were handled. Occurring outside the immediate jurisdiction of any single police force, a disappearance at sea created a legal and informational void. The cruise line became the sole gatekeeper of all evidence and information, including witnesses, internal reports, and the surveillance footage. A significant legal battle ended up taking place between Kendall Carver and the cruise line, and Carver would emerge victorious from this ordeal. Notably, through the discovery process, he was able to obtain all the internal evidence the cruise ship line wouldn't turn over. Despite this victory, he was unable to get any meaningful answers as to what happened to his daughter, which was ultimately what he wanted from the case. In February 2013, there was a startling development in the case. Remains were discovered on Mary Island, a small island in the Strait of Georgia in British Columbia, a province in Canada right next to Washington state. The location was geographically plausible. Lying in the general region, the Mercury would have passed on its way to or from Alaska. Canadian authorities suspected the remains could be those of Marion Carver. Police contacted Kendall Carver in Arizona, raising the possibility that DNA testing could finally provide a definitive answer to what happened to his daughter. Notably, it's unclear if these remains were hers, since while the initial finding was reported, nothing subsequent was, and Marion is still officially listed as missing. With no solid evidence of what happened to Marion, a number of theories have taken hold. One theory argues that a predator may have relied upon the transient population and the complex jurisdictional issues of a cruise ship to target Carver. According to some, cruise ships are targeted by these predators who see it as the place to commit the perfect crime, where legal complexities will simply shield them from consequences. Notably, some have suggested that Marion may have done it herself, given that she took the trip without informing anyone. However, her family denies this and confirmed that she would routinely travel at the absolute last minute without informing others. Personally, this seems odd to me, but people are allowed to have unusual character traits, and we can't all be the same. Notably, she never expressed any ideas like that, and there was no note left behind, or anything to indicate this could potentially be the case. Another common theory is that she accidentally fell overboard. People often become seasick on cruise ships, and this combination of being dizzy and throwing up over the deck can cause accidents to occur. Notably, I wasn't able to find the specific railing height for the Mercury, but it looks like the minimum railing on passenger vessels around that time was about 40 inches. I'm no expert on ocean-going vessels, so I can't really say if this is enough to ensure an adult can't accidentally go overboard, but I suspect it isn't. This is doubly true if someone is seasick and is leaning over the edge. Marion's case continues to remain unsolved and heavily discussed, especially given the bizarre circumstances surrounding her case and the fact that it happened on a cruise ship. The night of January 3rd, 1804, was cold, damp, and oppressively dark in the village of Hammersmith, then a small rural outpost on the western fringe of London. Its unlit passages, like the notorious Black Lion Lane, were narrow and enclosed by high hedges, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead even on a clear night. But this was not a clear night, and a mist crept up from the river, and a deeper, more chilling fog of fear had settled over the community for months. This was a named terror, a phantom that stalked the churchyard and its surrounding lanes, a specter the locals called the Hammersmith Ghost. Just after 11 o'clock, a lone figure dressed entirely in white moved through the gloom of Black Lion Lane. From the shadows, another man emerged, armed to the teeth and potentially boozed to the hilt, ready to face this so-called ghost. He leveled his weapon and shouted a challenge into the darkness, and when he got no response, he started blasting. The shooter, a 29-year-old officer named Francis Smith, cautiously approached what he believed was the vanquished specter that had terrorized his neighbors. But instead of a pile of ectoplasm, he found warm, solid flesh. Instead of a shroud, he found the clean white work clothes of a local tradesman. The ghost was Thomas Millwood, a 22-year-old bricklayer, his white flannel waistcoat and linen trousers now rapidly staining red. In a single panicked moment, a ghost story had been brutally inverted. The hunt for a supernatural monster had ended in a very human tragedy, and the true horror was not the phantom, but the violence born from the fear of it. This event would pose a profound question to the English legal system, one it was utterly unprepared to answer. Can a man be guilty for slaying a ghost he genuinely believed was real? The tragedy that unfolded in Black Lion Lane was not the result of a single man's rash action, but the culmination of a perfect storm of social hysteria and cultural superstition. For 2 months, from November 1803, the community of Hammersmith had been gripped by a growing panic. The sightings began as whispers and escalated into terrifying tales. Witnesses gave inconsistent descriptions of the apparition, a common feature of collective delusion. Some saw a tall figure draped in a white burial shroud, while others reported a more monstrous creature wearing a calfskin hide, complete with horns and large, ghastly glass eyes. Basically, think of a minotaur-like monster, and you wouldn't be far off at all. Notably, this phantom wasn't just some passive observer. A local brewer later testified that the entity had leaped from behind a tombstone and seized him by the throat. Unsubstantiated but widely circulated rumors claimed that a pregnant woman had been slain by the ghost. Another story told of a wagon driver who, upon seeing the specter, abandoned his team of 8 horses and 16 passengers to flee in terror. These stories found fertile ground in the cultural soil of the early 19th century, a time when scientific rationalism hadn't yet displaced deep-seated folk traditions. The community quickly developed a backstory for their tormentor, and determined that he was a restless spirit of a man who did the deed to himself. According to prevailing religious doctrine, an individual such as this couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, as it was thought their soul would be unable to find eternal rest. This man, however, had been interred in the Hammersmith churchyard, so his malevolent presence was seen not just as a random haunting, but as a direct consequence of a spiritual transgression, and the entire community was going to pay for it. Compounding the cultural validation of this supernatural fear was a near-total absence of effective law enforcement. The year was 1804, a full 25 years before Home Secretary Robert Peel would establish London's first professional, centrally organized police force. In this pre-Peel era, maintaining order was a fragmented and often inadequate affair, reliant on a patchwork of elected parish constables and paid night watchmen. These men were poorly equipped and lacked the organization to handle a widespread public panic. To give you a sense of the lack of professionality and organization, some of these watchmen were partly paid in fringe benefits like access to alcohol while on the job. The night watchman on duty during the incident himself claimed to have chased the ghost on a previous night, only for it to escape by shooting off its white sheet into his face. And no, you don't have to rewind. This watchman thought a real ghost threw a white sheet at him to escape, like some sort of salamander losing its tail. If you're wondering who was watching the night watchman, it was basically nobody. His response to the crisis wasn't to call for organized backup, but to agree to join Francis Smith's insane, drunken posse of clowns. Notably, while Smith was an officer in the armed forces, he had no official capacity when it came to community policing whatsoever. On the night of January 3rd, 2 men's paths converged in Black Lion Lane, set on a collision course by a combination of unfortunate choices and the pervasive atmosphere of fear. Thomas Millwood, the young bricklayer, had the profound misfortune of resembling a ghost. His trade required him to wear clothes that were uniformly white: linen trousers, a flannel waistcoat, and an apron, all kept meticulously clean. In the pitch-black, unlit lanes of a village on high alert for a white-shrouded creature, this attire was a serious hazard. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Millwood had been repeatedly warned about the danger. His family and even his landlord had seen the risk and begged him to wear a dark greatcoat over his work clothes when he went out at night. He had actually already been mistaken for the ghost on at least 2 previous occasions, but he basically wrote off the risks of anything serious happening. Francis Smith, the 29-year-old officer, was by all accounts a respectable and mild-mannered man who was eager to play the role of the hero in this tale. Multiple witnesses at his trial would testify to his humane and kind character, and he cared a lot about his community. He took it upon himself to take a leadership role in the posse that was patrolling the streets for the ghost. Francis was scared of ghosts, as was the style at the time when virtually everyone believed them to be a real threat. Because of this, the local pub offered him a strong drink or two to steel his nerves while he was out there on his ghost-busting mission. After Francis Smith realized the gravity of what he had done, he immediately found help and confessed what happened to two men, one of whom was named John Locke. But not that famous John Locke, since he would have been around 170 years old at the time. After transporting the body of Thomas Millwood to the Black Lion Inn with the help of the men, he immediately and promptly surrendered to a local constable expressing remorse. When Francis Smith stood trial at the Old Bailey just over a week later, he wasn't judged by the standards of a terrified villager, but by the cold, rigid logic of 19th century English law. The case exposed a deep chasm between common-sense morality and the strict letter of legal doctrine. Smith was charged with having ended the life of Millwood willfully and pleaded not guilty, his defense resting on the claim that he had made an honest and tragic mistake. He had believed he was confronting a dangerous supernatural entity and was in a state of mortal terror. The jury was clearly moved by this argument. They heard extensive testimony about the widespread panic the ghost had caused, the violent nature of its reported attacks, and Smith's own good character and profound remorse. After deliberating for an hour, they returned a verdict that reflected this sympathy. He was guilty of the much lesser crime of manslaughter, which acknowledged that he committed the act but had no malicious forethought whatsoever. It was a verdict that seemed to align with a sense of fairness and the tragedy that occurred. Literally nobody in the community thought Francis Smith committed this act intentionally in any way whatsoever. However, the presiding judge, Lord Chief Baron Sir Archibald MacDonald, flatly refused to accept the jury's finding. But before you think he's the villain in the case here, his actions would actually save the life of Smith. He informed the jury that, under the law as it stood, there were no circumstances in the case that could reduce the crime. Their only options were to find Smith guilty or to acquit him entirely. MacDonald's reasoning was a masterclass in the inflexible legal interpretation of the era. The judge held that Smith's actions met none of the criteria for the lesser charge. There was no evidence of self-defense, as Millwood had not attacked him, and he had merely advanced down the lane without responding to a challenge. Smith's subjective belief that he was facing a ghost was legally irrelevant. The law judged the objective act, not the actor's mistaken perception. MacDonald's most devastating point, however, was what became known as the best case fallacy. MacDonald, being an educated man of the Enlightenment, didn't accept the idea that a bullet could fell a ghost. The best case fallacy meant that Smith could have only reasonably believed that it was a human prankster impersonating a ghost. Impersonating a ghost and scaring people was a minor public nuisance offense at the time, and was punishable with as little as a warning. It wasn't a felony that could have ever justified the use of such extreme force. This judicial instruction left the jury with no room to maneuver. Trapped by the law's rigid logic, they were forced to reverse their decision and return a verdict of guilty, and this was a capital offense. Francis Smith, the mild-mannered man who set out to protect his community from a phantom, was sentenced to be hanged by the neck. The trial demonstrated how the legal system of the day operated like a machine, incapable of processing the messy, irrational data of human fear and honest error. The verdict wasn't a failure of the judge, who correctly applied the law, but a failure of the law itself to accommodate the complexities of the human mind. The legally correct but morally troubling verdict immediately set other forces in motion, revealing a more complex ecosystem of justice that operated beyond the courtroom walls. And just wait for it, because our friend Lord Justice MacDonald is going to put on a true masterclass of getting the right result while working within the strict confines of the system. The public reaction to Smith's sentence was one of overwhelming sympathy. Contemporary accounts describe the courtroom spectators as being deeply moved by his obvious contrition and terror at his fate. The entire country became convinced that the law was going to eliminate an innocent man, and this groundswell of public feeling had an immediate effect. Lord MacDonald, despite his rigid application of the law during the trial, was sensitive to the unique circumstances, and he decided to put the concept of justice above the law. He announced in court that he would immediately report the case to the king, George III. As any fan of this period of history knows, George III was completely mentally incapable by this point, so all royal decisions were made by his son, Prince George. This engaged a parallel justice system, the royal prerogative of mercy, an ancient power allowing the monarch to temper the strict sentences of the courts. The crown acted with remarkable speed, and the sentence was suspended almost immediately, while the crown figured out what to do. A few weeks later, Smith's sentence was officially commuted to 1 year of hard labor, as an acknowledgement that you can't simply get wasted and start blasting in urban areas. He was ultimately granted a full pardon and released after serving only about 6 months of his sentence. This royal intervention was a tacit admission from the highest authority in the land that the law had produced an unjust outcome. While the formal legal system was grappling with the consequences of the shooting, an informal system of social pressure was solving the original mystery. The intense publicity surrounding the trial and the tragic slaying of Thomas Millwood weighed on the conscience of the real, quote-unquote, ghost. 2 days after the shooting, a local boot and shoemaker named John Graham came forward and confessed. His motive was shockingly mundane and disproportionate to the terror he had caused. Graham explained that his apprentice had been scaring his young children with ghost stories. As a form of revenge, Graham decided to dress in a white sheet and frighten the apprentice on his way home through the churchyard. The prank was so successful that he apparently continued it for sport, becoming the infamous Hammersmith Ghost. When he surrendered to the local magistrates, they found themselves in a legal quandary. Given that his normally minor public nuisance offense had led to a tragedy, they were unsure exactly how to charge him. To bring a big case and leave the man with a fine seemed almost insulting to the legacy of Millwood, so they released him on the condition that he never impersonate a ghost again, and according to the historical record, he never did. In one final weird historical mystery arising from this case, something strange began to happen after. People began to claim to see the true spirit of Thomas Millwood in Hammersmith, and at the Black Lion Inn, where his body was taken that night. This has raised the question whether John Graham, the so-called real Hammersmith ghost, was the only person dressing up and scaring people at the time. Given that the ghost sightings went on for years after, I have a few thoughts about this part of the Hammersmith enigma. I suspect John Graham may have continued being a public nuisance regardless of telling the authorities that he wouldn't be one. After all, his initial story is quite odd since he managed to scare his apprentice but just kept doing it anyway. Further, given that the case had become a nationwide phenomenon, I also think that some thrill seekers may have tossed on a sheet in a one-off event. As for the sightings within the Black Lion Inn itself, it seems like a mass hysteria event overlaid upon a sincere belief in ghosts. After all, if there was anyone who would be a vengeful spirit in this situation, it was Thomas Millwood, the innocent man who was walking home in his work-mandated clothing. In April 1998, a disturbing discovery surfaced in a Texas lake. The body of an unidentified woman was found in a waterway between Lake Lavon and Lake Hubbard, just east of Dallas. The victim's face was unrecognizable after weeks in the water, and with no ID or clues to her identity, police categorized her as a Jane Doe, a nameless victim of a violent crime. From the start, authorities recognized that this woman had met a violent end. An autopsy confirmed she had been shot multiple times, and by the time her body was recovered, decomposition suggested she had been dead for 1 to 4 weeks. Investigators suspected she was slain elsewhere and dumped in Lake Lavon, and that her remains drifted through floodgates where she was ultimately found. Nothing obvious was missing, which meant robbery was probably not the motive, though the authorities couldn't say for sure. With no identification, detectives had little to go on in 1998. They entered the case in national databases and dubbed her the Collin County Jane Doe, a name by which she would be known for decades. A forensic artist created a composite sketch of the victim's face to show the public, hoping someone might recognize her features. Despite circulating the sketch and the case details, no one came forward with a name. The mystery woman remained unidentified as months turned into years, and her file slowly went cold. By the year 2024, a new forensic technology was giving hope to cold cases like this. And yeah, stop me if you've heard this one before. In 2024, the Collin County Medical Examiner's Office partnered with Othram and were able to extract a comprehensive genetic profile. From there, they were able to reconstruct her family tree and positively identify her as Penny Gunn in August 2025. The identification of Penny was a landmark moment, and she reclaimed her name after nearly 3 decades of anonymity. Once her identity was known, details of Penny's life began to emerge. Penny was born in 1962, and public records show she lived in multiple states, including Iowa and Washington, before eventually coming to Texas. She had married in the late 1980s and taken the last name Morris. By the late 1990s, Penny was living in the Dallas area, possibly in the city of Garland, just a few miles from where her body was found. This suggests that she was slain close to home. It's unclear whether a missing person report was ever filed for Penny at the time of her disappearance. Some online sleuths have speculated that she may have been reported under her maiden name, though this remains unclear at this time. With Penny's identity restored, the investigation into her slaying is picking up steam again. Detectives are now looking into her past and the people in her life for clues about who might have harmed her. Notably, while it appears from present evidence that she was still legally married at the time of her disappearance, it's unclear if she was separated or not. Investigators will presumably want to speak to her husband or ex-husband, since that individual will almost certainly be of high interest to the investigation. While we don't yet know what happened to Penny, what's clear is that after 27 years, investigators are determined to get answers. They've advised that they're interviewing anyone who knew Penny and retracing her last known steps in Texas. If you knew Penny Morris, who may have gone by her maiden name, I would encourage you to reach out to the Collin County Sheriff's Office. Even if you knew her years prior to what happened, even the most seemingly insignificant piece of evidence could crack this case wide open. On a cold November evening in 1643, with the thunder of cannon fire shaking the walls of Rottweil, hundreds of frightened townspeople gathered inside the Dominican church. Clutching their rosaries, they prayed desperately for deliverance from the siege outside. According to numerous accounts, their prayers were answered in a most startling way. The statue of the Virgin Mary on the altar seemed to come alive. Witnesses said Mary's face shifted in color and her eyes moved, gazing upward, and then back down toward the beleaguered city. Some believed they heard her voice in the hushed church. This 1643 incident, later known as Our Lady of the Turning Eyes, would become one of the most famous miracles of the 30 Years' War. In the autumn of 1643, the walled city of Rottweil, a Catholic stronghold in the Holy Roman Empire, was battered by a siege in the last decade of the 30 Years' War. The French had fully encircled the city, cutting off supplies while the walls of the city withstood bombardment. The situation grew desperate as bombardments breached sections of the aging medieval walls by mid-November. Inside Rottweil, fear and turmoil reigned, and the exhausted defenders argued over whether to hold out or surrender to the enemy, who promised to spare civilians if the city yielded. It was in this dire atmosphere that an extraordinary event was reported. The Dominican friars, together with hundreds of townspeople, held continuous rosary prayers inside Rottweil's Dominican church. According to eyewitnesses, on November 10th, 1643, the statue of the Virgin Mary at the altar suddenly changed. The Madonna's face appeared to turn pale, and her carved eyes came to life and moved, shifting upward toward heaven, then downward toward the congregation and the city. Some present even claimed they heard a soft sigh or word from the statue. Both Catholics and a few skeptical Protestants who had taken refuge in the church witnessed this uncanny occurrence. Stunned worshippers were reportedly moved to tears and awe at the sight. News of the miracle of the turning eyes spread through the city in the following days. Many believers interpreted Mary's movements as a direct response to their fervent prayers, as if the Virgin were acknowledging their pleas and interceding with her Son for Rottweil's safety. This helped the besieged Rottweilers' morale immensely, and all talks of giving up the city ceased. On November 25th, 1643, about 2 weeks after the first incident, a second phenomenon was reported. Witnesses saw the statue's face, formerly so pale, suddenly become flush with color, as if the statue had once again come to life. Once again her eyes seemed to shift their gaze, and a few tears were seen glistening on her cheeks. That same night, miles away at Tuttlingen, a relief army of Bavarian, Spanish, and Imperial forces launched a surprise attack on the French camp. The enemy was completely routed in the Battle of Tuttlingen, and the siege of Rottweil was abruptly lifted. To the faithful, the timing was no coincidence. Clearly, the intercession of the Virgin Mary had saved the city. The reported miracle at Rottweil reverberated throughout Catholic Europe. In 1643, the war's 25th year, Catholics saw this event as a powerful sign of divine favor amid chaos. The occurrence came during the Counter-Reformation's peak of Marian devotion, when Mary was often invoked as a heavenly protectress in battle. To the faithful, the Virgin's intervention at Rottweil seemed to confirm that heaven was on their side. Catholic preachers and writers pointed to the episode as proof of their true faith's power, encouraging the devout to persevere. According to contemporary accounts, some Protestants who witnessed the event were reported to have been so moved by the occurrence that they converted to Catholicism. Given the dozens of eyewitness accounts and the rapid spread of the story in print, church authorities took the claims of 1643 very seriously. A formal inquiry gathered the testimony of 42 eyewitnesses, and on March 14th, 1644, the church officially confirmed the miracle as worthy of belief. That same year, a printed report of the event circulated in Catholic regions, spreading Rottweil's fame. The church soon became a site of pilgrimage, with many visitors coming to venerate the miraculous image, with some even claiming cures or other favors in Mary's name. There are three common explanations for what happened at Rottweil. The traditional Catholic interpretation views this incident as a genuine miracle. According to this theory, the Virgin Mary, moved by the fervent prayers of the besieged residents, visibly turned her eyes as a sign of compassion, reassurance, and divine protection. Supporters point to the precise timing of the second event, which occurred just before Rottweil was miraculously relieved in the Battle of Tuttlingen. For centuries, this has remained the dominant explanation among believers, solidifying Rottweil's Marian devotion and confirming for many the legitimacy of their Catholic faith. A popular skeptical modern theory suggests that the incident resulted from a psychological phenomenon, specifically mass hysteria or collective delusion induced by extreme stress. In 1643, the residents of Rottweil were under intense psychological strain due to prolonged siege warfare, fear, hunger, and uncertainty. Under these conditions, suggestible individuals may have interpreted subtle visual cues, such as flickering candlelight, shadows, or reflections, as movements of the statue's eyes. According to this view, as news of the event spread, confirmation bias and peer pressure likely reinforced eyewitness accounts, solidifying the event's perceived miraculous nature. Another modern explanation proposes that the phenomenon was the result of a natural optical illusion. The apparent shifting eyes and changes in facial coloration could have been due to shifting light conditions from candles, torches, and reflective surfaces within the church. Wooden statues, painted and varnished, can appear to move subtly depending on the angle of illumination and viewer perspective, particularly under flickering candlelight. Small environmental factors like humidity, temperature changes, or minor movements of the statue's supporting structure may also have contributed to the illusion. According to this explanation, this may have convinced observers that they had witnessed a miraculous event. Whatever the case, what's clear is that the first sighting calmed the nerves of the people of Rottweil. The second sighting, 2 weeks later, and coinciding with the break of the siege, appeared to confirm that this event had led to the deliverance of the town. On the night of June 20th, 1947, Bugsy Siegel was relaxing, without an apparent care in the world. Inside a lavish Beverly Hills mansion at 810 North Linden Drive, he sat on a floral-covered sofa next to his associate, Alan Smiley. The 41-year-old gangster, known for his violent temper but also his considerable charm, seemed to be in good spirits, casually reading the Los Angeles Times under the glow of a table lamp. The living room drapes were wide open to the warm California night, an oversight for a man with a long list of enemies. Outside, hidden in the darkness and less than 14 feet away, a marksman took aim. The hitman rested the barrel of an M1 carbine on the exterior of the window and pointed towards his illuminated target. Then, suddenly and without warning, shortly before 11, the quiet was shattered by a volley of 9 shots, tearing through the glass. 4 of the 9 shots found their mark with brutal precision. 2 bullets ripped into Siegel's torso. 2 more struck his head, and for Bugsy, the end was almost certainly instantaneous. Alan Smiley, in a miraculous stroke of luck, dove to the floor as the shooting started and escaped with only a bullet hole tearing through the sleeve of his jacket. To understand who pulled the trigger, and more importantly, who gave the order, one must first understand the man whose violent life came to an even more violent end. Bugsy was born into a world he was determined to escape by any means necessary. The son of poor Jewish immigrants from the Galicia region of Austria-Hungary, he was born in Brooklyn in 1906 and grew up surrounded by the poverty of the Lower East Side. He rejected the humble life of meager wages his parents endured and, from a young age, sought a faster path to wealth and status through crime. He started by running a brutal protection racket, targeting pushcart peddlers from his community who operated in a legal gray zone. If a vendor refused to pay for his protection, someone would just happen to douse their cart in kerosene and set it ablaze, a terrifyingly effective business model. It was on these tough streets that Siegel forged the most important alliance of his life. He befriended Meyer Lansky, another ambitious teenager who possessed the intellect and strategic mind that perfectly complemented Siegel's sheer aggression and fearlessness. Together, they formed the Bugs and Meyer mob, a gang that quickly became a feared force in New York's underworld. With the advent of Prohibition, they moved into the lucrative business of bootlegging, hijacking liquor shipments from rival outfits, and serving as hitmen for various crime families. Siegel's personality was a study in contradictions. He was strikingly handsome, impeccably dressed, and charismatic. He was obsessed with the concept of class, believing it was the only thing that mattered in life. He cultivated an image of sophistication, buying an apartment in the Waldorf Astoria and routinely visiting high-end nightclubs where he would flex his success. He was vain, using face creams and washes every morning and night to maintain his youthful looks in what I can only assume was the style of Patrick Bateman. In the mid-1930s, after establishing himself as a hitman in NYC, Siegel was sent to California to expand underworld operations on the West Coast. He quickly consolidated control over gambling, ladies of negotiable affection, and a variety of substances. But he also found a new stage for his unique persona: Hollywood. He became a fixture in the celebrity social scene, befriending A-list stars like Cary Grant, Gary Cooper, and Frank Sinatra. This dual identity as a charming socialite and a brutal predator was more than just a lifestyle. It was a highly effective professional strategy. His glamorous Hollywood connections provided a perfect cover for his criminal activities. This allowed him to operate in plain sight as one of the nation's first front-page celebrity gangsters, who was known to the public primarily for his social connections and charm. He leveraged his friendships for direct financial gain, borrowing $500,000 from movie stars and movie executives. His gentlemanly persona made these wealthy and powerful people believe he would make good on these loans, but he never really intended to repay them. However, Siegel's ultimate ambition lay east of Hollywood, in what was then the dusty desert town of Las Vegas. The vision for a new kind of luxury resort in Las Vegas, however, wasn't originally his. It belonged to Billy Wilkerson, the influential publisher of The Hollywood Reporter and a successful developer of popular nightclubs. Wilkerson envisioned a sophisticated European-style hotel and casino that would stand in stark contrast to the rustic establishments that then existed on the Strip. But Wilkerson, a heavy gambler himself, quickly ran out of funds during construction. Seeing an opportunity, Siegel, backed by millions of dollars from Lansky and other mob interests, muscled his way into the project, eventually forcing Wilkerson out and taking complete control. With the project in his hands, Siegel's obsession with class and his lack of business acumen proved a disastrous combination. Or should I say, it appeared to be disastrous at the time, since, as you'll see, many of the steps he took to make the Flamingo unique would be what made Las Vegas what it was and is. The hotel's budget, initially estimated at around $1.5 million, spiraled out of control to a staggering $6 million. Siegel demanded unprecedented luxuries, many of which were unheard of in the desert at the time. Each apparently misspent dollar would be yet another woodpecker of mistrust, brutally pecking away at the bonds between Bugsy and his financial backers. He insisted on full air conditioning, lush gardens with imported palm trees, and most extravagantly, private sewer lines for each of the hotel's 105 rooms. Interestingly, Bugsy ended up getting fleeced repeatedly and consistently by contractors who realized that he had a lot of money and no business sense. He would nickname this hotel and casino resort in the desert the Flamingo, supposedly as a nod to his girlfriend, who had notably long legs. Back east, his mob investors were furious, and they grew deeply suspicious that the massive cost overruns were not just due to mismanagement. They believed that he may be skimming millions of dollars from the mob to fund his fancy Burt Reynolds tier lifestyle. The situation came to a head in late December 1946 at the National Hotel in Cuba, where Lucky Luciano, now exiled from America, convened a major summit of crime bosses. One of the most pressing items on the agenda was what to do about Bugsy Siegel and his money pit in the desert. Many of the bosses argued that Siegel had shown blatant disrespect and had to be eliminated. The meeting reached a dramatic climax when Meyer Lansky stood up to defend his childhood friend. According to some who later talked about what happened at this legendary meeting, Lansky's advocacy ended up saving Bugsy's hide for the time being. His life hinged on whether the Flamingo would be the massive money printer it was supposed to be. The opening, scheduled for the day after Christmas 1946, was a complete catastrophe. A rare winter storm grounded the private plane Siegel had chartered to fly in his Hollywood friends. While some celebrities made it, the star power was severely diminished. Worse, the hotel portion of the resort wasn't even finished, so there were no rooms for the gamblers who did show up. The high rollers who won big at the tables simply took their cash and went to stay and spend at the neighboring hotels and casinos. Within its first week, the Flamingo's casino lost a reported $300,000. Humiliated and hemorrhaging money, Siegel was forced to shut the doors within weeks of the opening while the casino restructured. However, he would soon be cut down by that bullet, and he would never be able to fully oversee the next steps in the Flamingo's life cycle. The most widely accepted explanation for Siegel's slaying is that it was a cold, calculated business decision made by mob interests. From the mob's perspective, Siegel was a liability. He had mismanaged a massive $6 million investment, shown blatant disrespect to his powerful backers, and was widely suspected of stealing from them. In the unforgiving world of organized crime, these were capital offenses. His execution was a message to everyone in their sphere of influence. No one, no matter how famous or feared, was above the bottom line. The most compelling evidence supporting this theory is the swift and seamless takeover of the Flamingo. Just minutes after the shots were fired in Beverly Hills, three of Lansky's top associates, Mo Sedway, Gus Greenbaum, and Morris Rosen, walked into the Flamingo's casino. They calmly announced to the staff that they were now in charge and immediately started running the show under the direction of Lansky. This perfectly coordinated transition, executed almost simultaneously with the slaying hundreds of miles away, strongly indicates a pre-planned action. Under this theory, Lansky had advocated for his friend at the Havana conference and promised that Bugsy would make good on his promises. Lansky in turn is speculated to have been told that if his friend didn't make good, he would have to do the deed himself. While the mob hit remains the historical consensus, Siegel's slaying is still officially an unsolved case, and several compelling alternative theories have emerged over the decades. Another plausible scenario points to a more personal motive: revenge. Siegel's relationship with his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, was famously passionate, but also incredibly volatile, to the point where it was an open secret that he was roughing her up. This has led to the theory that one of Hill's brothers eliminated Siegel in retaliation. An employee who worked at the Flamingo claimed that he personally overheard one of Hill's brothers, a U.S. Marine, threaten to shoot Siegel after seeing bruises on his sister. Notably, Hill's behavior itself was quite suspicious, and she took a completely unplanned flight to Europe just days prior to the attack. Some think that she had been skimming money from the mob herself, and that she helped set up Bugsy in return for the mob looking the other way from her transgressions. Others speculate that she knew what her brother was going to do, and that she had a discussion with Lansky about it. In this scenario, Lansky gave the okay for her brother to attack Bugsy, but needed the details of the attack. This, in essence, secured her brother from retaliation going forward, and gave Lansky time to plan the takeover of the Flamingo. It also would have saved Lansky the trouble of directly taking out the man he came up in the organized crime world with. Despite the speculation and the compelling nature of these theories, the slaying of Bugsy Siegel remains one of America's most famous cold cases. No one was ever charged, and the Beverly Hills Police Department file still somehow officially remains open today, even though the perpetrator is surely deceased. Perhaps the ultimate irony of Siegel's life is that his greatest failure became his most enduring legacy. The Flamingo, which he reopened in March 1947, had just begun to show a profit by May, but if he was eliminated for that reason, it was too little too late to save him. After his passing, under the shrewd management of Moe Sedway and Gus Greenbaum, with Lansky acting as overseer, the resort became an immediate and massive success. It reportedly earned a very handsome profit of $4 million in its first year of operation, and the cost overruns were completely covered. This success proved the viability of Bugsy's vision and kicked off the golden age of mob-controlled casinos in Las Vegas. Hey everyone, Jimmy here, asking you to hit that hype button and hype up this video. This helps the visibility of this video in the algorithm and helps out my channel massively. Anyway, we've got a lot more ground to cover, so let's get back to business. It takes less than 5 minutes for a family's world to shatter. To put this in perspective, this is less time than it takes to boil a kettle of water or to give Freebird a listen. In that brief window, a perfect June afternoon can curdle into a nightmare, and a beloved child can step behind a bush and drop off the face of the earth. For the Martin family, that window opened and closed on June 14, 1969, in the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. What followed was not just the frantic search for a missing boy, but a story of chaos, heartbreak, and an unexpected legacy that would change the science of saving lives forever. This is the story of Dennis Martin, the vanished boy who would capture the nation's attention. For the Martin family of Knoxville, Tennessee, the annual Father's Day weekend camping trip was a cherished tradition. In June 1969, William Martin led the familiar expedition, bringing his 2 sons, 9-year-old Douglas and 6-year-old Dennis, along with his own father, Clyde. For Dennis, who was just 6 days shy of his 7th birthday, this was his first time along on this trip. The first day went as planned, and the family hiked from Cades Cove to Russell Field, camping for the night before continuing their journey on Saturday, June 14th. Their destination was Spence Field, a beautiful highland meadow nestled along the Appalachian Trail, known for its stunning views. There they met up with another family, and the afternoon unfolded in the idyllic way of such outings, with the adults relaxing and the children playing. Sometime after lunch, the boys hatched a plan. In a fit of youthful excitement, they decided to play a prank on the adults by splitting up, hiding in the dense foliage that bordered the meadow, and jumping out to surprise them. William Martin watched with amusement as the children whispered and plotted. Because Dennis was wearing a bright red t-shirt, the older boys worried he'd be too easy to spot, so they sent him off in a different direction to hide by himself. It was a seemingly innocent decision, and in any other moment it would have been a minor and forgotten detail in a children's game. But that red shirt, which should have been a beacon of visibility, would instead become an icon of an impenetrable mystery. At approximately 4:30 that afternoon, the mousetrap was sprung. The older boys leaped from their hiding places with shouts and laughter, but Dennis didn't appear. His father, William, had seen him go behind a bush just moments before, and at first there was no alarm. But as the seconds ticked by, a knot of unease began to form, and time began to move slowly. William would later estimate that 5 minutes passed, and initial concern turned into full-blown panic. He began calling his son's name, his voice cutting through the mountain air, but there was no answer. William immediately began a frantic search, running down the trail for nearly 2 miles, convinced his small son couldn't have gone any farther. The other adults joined in, scouring the nearby woods, but absolutely nothing was found. As dusk began to settle over the mountains, the family's nightmare was compounded by a new, formidable adversary: the weather. A severe thunderstorm rolled in with terrifying speed, unleashing a biblical deluge which caused streams to develop into raging torrents. Temperatures dropped to unseasonable lows, only about a dozen degrees off freezing. The storm was more than just bad luck. It was a catastrophic event that acted as an accomplice to the disappearance. It systematically erased the few clues that might have existed, washing away footprints, obliterating any scent for search dogs, and ensuring the scene was wiped clean. The official search for Dennis Martin began at 5 the next morning, Sunday, June 15th. What started with a crew of 30 National Park Service personnel rapidly escalated into the largest search and rescue operation in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The numbers were staggering, and within a day, the force grew to 240 people. By Dennis's 7th birthday on June 20th, nearly 800 people were combing the mountainside. The effort peaked on June 21st, with an astonishing 1,400 searchers involved. The call for help had been answered by a diverse and dedicated coalition. There were park rangers, local rescue squads from several states, scout troops, college students, firefighters, and even 40 elite Green Berets from Fort Bragg. The story captivated the nation, with President Richard Nixon reportedly monitoring the situation from the White House. Notably, this massive search effort actually had more in common with a disorganized posse than with what we presently think of when we think of search and rescue. At the time, the National Park Service had no detailed, pre-existing search and rescue doctrines. The prevailing philosophy was called surround and drown, where you just take as big a wave of people and sniffer dogs as possible and deluge the area. This surround and drown approach proved to be a catastrophic mistake. The massive, uncoordinated wave of well-intentioned but largely inexperienced volunteers descended on the area, inadvertently destroying the very evidence they were there to find. Potential footprints were trampled, scents that may have still existed were contaminated, and delicate clues like broken twigs were obliterated. The paradox is disturbing. The immense public desire to help did more to hurt the efforts than anything else. The search was officially scaled back on June 26th, largely abandoned by June 29th, and formally closed on September 14th, 1969. The deluge of men and women had receded, leaving the mountain just as silent as it was the moment Dennis disappeared. In the vacuum left by the failed search, theories began to grow. With no body, no clothing, and no concrete evidence, the disappearance of Dennis Martin became a case on which people projected their wildest fears. The most straightforward and officially accepted theory is that Dennis simply wandered off, became disoriented, and perished from exposure or an accident. The area is known for its incessant winds that can easily drown out a small child's cries. While there's no direct evidence to support this claim, this is the official stance of the authorities. The Great Smoky Mountains are home to a variety of wildlife, including black bears and feral pigs, leading to speculation that Dennis was attacked and carried off. Some reports from the time noted that a drought the previous year had made animals bolder and hungrier than usual. However, wildlife experts and many investigators were skeptical of this theory. A predatory attack on a human by a black bear is exceedingly rare, and an event violent enough to carry away a child would almost certainly have left behind some evidence. Still, this theory hasn't been entirely dismissed and is theoretically possible. From the beginning, Dennis's father, William Martin, believed his son was kidnapped. This theory hinges on a single and deeply problematic piece of testimony. On the afternoon Dennis vanished, a tourist named Harold Key and his family were in the park, miles from Spence Field. They reported hearing a loud scream, and then shortly thereafter, they witnessed a rough-looking man advancing through the woods. For investigators, it was a highly unreliable lead. The sighting occurred around 5 trail miles from the disappearance site, a significant distance for someone to carry a child in a short amount of time through rough terrain. Further, there are no direct trails connecting the two locations, meaning that this man would have had to have taken Dennis through the woods directly. The absolute lack of resolution in the Dennis Martin case created a perfect environment for regional legends to attach themselves to the story. Generally, I don't mention these sort of theories for cases such as this, but here there appears to be a significant amount of people who advocate for this theory. For generations, local folklore has included tales of feral people living in the wilderness. Inevitably, the story of the lost boy became intertwined with these legends, with some speculating he was taken by such a group. Notably, Harold Key's description of an unkempt and shaggy man is cited as evidence by people who believe this theory. More than 50 years later, the fate of Dennis Martin remains one of the Great Smoky Mountains' most profound and enduring mysteries. The forest has kept its secret, and it's virtually impossible that we will ever know for certain what happened in those brief minutes at Spence Field. For now, Dennis Martin's case remains yet another haunting, unsolved national park enigma. In 1988, an unidentified serial perpetrator is believed to have slain at least 9 women and caused the disappearances of 2 others in Massachusetts. This individual has become known to law enforcement and the general public as the New Bedford Highway Killer. The victims were primarily companionship workers struggling with addiction and were discovered along and around major highways, notably Interstate 195 and Route 140. Robin Rhodes, 29, is believed to have gone missing sometime in March or April 1988. She was eventually discovered on March 28, 1989, along Massachusetts Route 140 southbound in Freetown by a search dog. Unlike most of the other women, she was not known to be involved in illicit activities, though she was known to associate with people who were. Rochelle Doperala, 28, disappeared sometime during late April 1988. On December 10, 1988, her body was discovered by people riding ATVs in a gravel pit along Reed Road, about 2 miles from Interstate 195. In May 1988, 25-year-old Deborah Lynn McConnell of Newport was last seen by her father following her mother's funeral. She is considered to be the 3rd victim. A cadaver dog found her body on December 1st, 1988, off Massachusetts Route 140 northbound in Freetown. On May 27, 1988, 29-year-old Deborah Medeiros of Fall River was reported missing after a fight with her boyfriend in New Bedford. Although Deborah's boyfriend was initially a person of interest, he was ruled out as a suspect. 19-year-old Christina Montero was last seen sometime in May 1988. She's not been heard from since, though according to authorities she's presumed deceased. It's unclear why authorities believe this. However, given that this is an active, ongoing investigation, evidence is released on a need-to-know basis. Marilyn Cardoza Roberts, 34, was last seen sometime in June 1988 and was reported missing in December 1988. She lived near Christina Montero and, like Montero, remains missing to this day. Also, like Montero, she's presumed deceased with no indication given as to why this is the case. 36-year-old Nancy Lee Paiva of New Bedford was last seen walking home from Whispers Pub on July 7, 1988, following an argument with her boyfriend in the early hours. Her body was found on July 30, 1988, beside Interstate 195 in Dartmouth, lying on her back, with her feet pointed toward the highway. Authorities noted that the staging of her body was similar to how Deborah Medeiros was discovered, suggesting the same perpetrator. Naturally, her boyfriend was initially considered a suspect, but was eventually cleared of all suspicion. On July 11, 1988, 35-year-old Deborah Greenlaw DeMello was last seen in New Bedford. Her body was discovered on November 8, 1988, off the eastbound Reed Road ramp of Interstate 195 by a highway crew. Her clothing was scattered among tree branches, and she was found in possession of some of Nancy Paiva's belongings. 26-year-old Mary Rose Santos, from New Bedford, was dropped off near the downtown bus station on July 16, 1988, by her husband. She was last seen dancing at the old quarterdeck lounge about 5 hours later. Her body was eventually discovered on March 31, 1989, along Massachusetts Route 88 in Westport by two boys. Sandra Botello, 24, reportedly left her apartment at 11 p.m. on August 11, 1988, and never returned. She was the final victim to be discovered, found on April 24, 1989, in the woods along Interstate 195 in Marion. On September 4, 1988, 25-year-old Dawn Mendez was last seen leaving her apartment in New Bedford to attend a family christening. Her mostly skeletal remains were discovered on November 29, 1988, on the westbound Reed Road ramp off Interstate 195 by a sniffer dog. The investigation into these slayings was extensive, involving local and state law enforcement agencies. Several suspects were considered, including local attorney Kenneth Ponte, who had represented some of the victims in legal matters. Ponte was indicted for the slaying of one victim, 28-year-old Rochelle Doparala, but the charges were later dropped due to insufficient evidence. Another potential suspect, Anthony DeGrazia, was arrested for a variety of SA activities in the area. While he was out on bail, the authorities stated that he was the prime suspect in the New Bedford slayings. As a result of this, he was either slain, potentially by a loved one of the women, or taken out by his own hand. Notably, the authorities later retracted the statement that he was the quote-unquote prime suspect in this case. Perhaps the most intriguing theory revolves around a European serial perpetrator known as the Lisbon Ripper. Between 1992 and 1993, 3 women in Lisbon were found slain, their bodies bearing signs of vicious attacks. Speculation about a possible connection emerged because both cases involved victims of Portuguese ancestry. Some theorists propose that the Lisbon Ripper and the New Bedford highway killer could be the same individual, supported by the timeline and the supposedly eerily similar victim profiles. In 1785, a farmer plowing a field near the ruins of an ancient Roman town struck something hard in the soil. He unearthed a heavy gold ring, an artifact that's now nearly 1,600 years old, and unwittingly stepped into a mystery that spans millennia. This was no ordinary lost ring. It was the ring of Silvianus, an object entangled with an ancient curse. In the decades to follow, historians would connect this ring to a Roman curse tablet that demanded divine vengeance on the thief responsible for taking the ring. The Ring of Silvianus is a Roman gold ring dating to around the 4th or 5th century AD. It's an unusually large ring, so hefty that it may have been designed to be worn over a glove. The design is striking. The ring's band has 10 facets and carries a Latin inscription, and it's topped with a square face engraved with a figure of the goddess Venus. And if there was any doubt as to who was being depicted on it, the ring literally says Venus engraved into the face. This means it likely functioned as a signet ring, used to stamp a seal in wax. When pressed, the word and the face would appear in the seal. More curious is the inscription on the band. It reads, Seniciane vivas in Deo, or it should read that, except the engraver seems to have botched it slightly by doubling an I and possibly leaving off the final O. The intended message is, Senicianus, live in God, a phrase typical of Roman Christian piety. In other words, the name Senicianus is literally carved into this ring, with a very Christian prayer despite the fact that the ring's face has a pagan Roman goddess on it. This mix of symbolism, a pagan deity on one side and a Christian blessing on the other, reflects a transitional time in Roman Britain. During this period, old beliefs and the new Christian faith coexisted and sometimes mingled in ways that are generally confusing to the modern mind. However, as you're about to see, this may not have been an example of religious syncretism, but rather the tale of a theft that spans back to antiquity. When the farmer found the ring in a field near Silchester, he probably had little idea of its significance. The year was 1785, and Britain was just beginning to appreciate the historical riches beneath its soil. The ring's large size and mysterious inscriptions must have caused a stir. By January 1786, the artifact was presented to the Society of Antiquaries in London by a local nobleman, Lord Arden. Soon after, the ring vanished from public view for many decades, not lost but tucked away in a private collection. It eventually made its way into the possession of the Shute family, prominent antiquarians who owned a Tudor manor called the Vine. Exactly how the ring ended up with the Shute family remains a bit of a mystery. It's presumed that the farmer or Lord Arden sold or gifted it to them, given the Shute's known interest in historical curiosities. By the late 19th century, the ring was safely kept in the Vine's library, largely forgotten by the outside world. It might have stayed an obscure family heirloom had it not been for a remarkable discovery made about 80 miles away. This is a discovery that would link this ring to an ancient curse and catapult it into archaeological legend. In the early 19th century, a peculiar tablet surfaced at the ruins of a Roman temple in Lydney, Gloucestershire. Lydney's temple, perched on a hill overlooking the River Severn, was dedicated to the Celtic god Nodens, a deity of healing and of the sea. The site was rich with finds, but this little tablet was especially intriguing. It was a curse tablet, a type of artifact used in Roman times to appeal to the gods for justice or revenge. When researchers eventually deciphered the Latin inscription on the Lydney tablet, they discovered a story that sounds eerily familiar. Quote, "For the god Nodens, Silvianus has lost a ring and has donated half its worth to Nodens. Among those named Senicianus, permit no health until the ring is returned to the temple of Nodens." Here was a man, Silvianus, beseeching a god to curse whoever stole his ring, even calling out the suspected thief by name, Senicianus. The text even notes Silvianus's promise to give half the ring's value to the deity if the culprit is brought to justice. In a dramatic flourish, someone later scratched the word redivivus, renewed, at the top of the tablet, as if refreshing the curse so it wouldn't fade with time. Imagine the anger and desperation behind that act. Silvianus clearly really wanted his ring back, or at least revenge. For years, this curse tablet sat as a curious piece of local lore. It wasn't until 1888 that the connection between the curse and the ring was publicly suggested. That year, Challoner Shute, the owner of the vine, published a history of his estate and included both the gold ring and the curse inscription in his book. Shute speculated about the dealings of Silvianus and Sinicianus, essentially proposing that the very ring in his possession was the one mentioned in the Lydney curse. The coincidence was hard to ignore. The rare name Sinicianus appeared both on the ring and in the curse. If Shute was right, the farmer's field in Silchester had yielded the actual stolen ring that Silvianus cursed well over 1,000 years ago. It was a historian's eureka moment, connecting two artifacts that had been separated by time and distance. Linking the ring to the curse raises as many questions as it answers. For starters, if this ring of Silvianus in the vine is indeed Silvianus's stolen property, why does it bear Sinicianus's name and not Silvianus's? One theory is that Sinicianus, after stealing the ring, had the gall to engrave his own name and a dedication to God on it. This was perhaps attempting to protect himself from Silvianus's curse by invoking the Christian deity. In a world where many still worship Jupiter and Venus, writing "Live in God" on the ring could have been a way of saying that the ring was under the protection of the new god of Rome. If true, it's a bold and ironic move by a thief, using a prayer as a shield against a curse. Another puzzle is the distance. The ring was found near Silchester in Hampshire, but the curse tablet was at Lydney in Gloucestershire, roughly 80 miles apart. Travel was certainly possible in Roman Britain, but it begs the question, did Sinicianus flee with the ring across the country? Or could it be that Silvianus and Sinicianus were actually locals around Silchester, and Silvianus traveled to Lydney's temple on a pilgrimage to place the curse? Notably, archaeologists found that Lydney's temple complex included a dormitory for pilgrims. This raises the potential scenario that Silvianus lost his ring while he was sleeping at the temple and someone swiped it. In that case, Sinicianus might have been another visitor who snatched the ring and made for Silchester. If the thief thought he could escape the eye of a local god by putting miles between him and the temple, he underestimated Silvianus's determination. The curse was essentially a wanted poster to the gods that could follow a culprit anywhere. Crucially, we don't actually know if the ring found in Silchester is the one from the Lydney curse, but the evidence is compelling. The name Sinicianus is uncommon. Finding it on both the ring and the tablet is likely more than chance. Still, some scholars urge caution, and there's no absolute proof linking the two items, and many scholars view the whole thing as a very unlikely coincidence and nothing more. But even so, the link is essentially irresistible for anyone who likes to tell a good story, and historians enjoy a good story more than the average person. As if ancient mysteries weren't enough, the ring of Silvianus has also woven itself into modern legend thanks to a possible connection with Tolkien. In 1929, the archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler was excavating the Lydney Temple site and researching the curse of Silvianus. Recognizing that the strange name Nodens might have linguistic significance, Wheeler sought the help of Tolkien, who at the time was a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford. Tolkien took on the task of investigating the name of this obscure deity. In the course of their discussions, Wheeler almost certainly mentioned the curious tale of the cursed ring that had turned up at the Vine. Tolkien, a scholar of myths and languages, and someone who you could say was a fan of world building, would have been captivated by this real-life saga. To foreshadow where I'm going next with this, you've got the story of a stolen ring with a bizarre inscription, a curse, and divine forces competing for this one ring. Now here's where history and literary legend start to intertwine. Just a few years after Tolkien's involvement with the Sylvianus case, he began writing The Hobbit, published in 1937, in which a certain magical ring plays a crucial part. That ring, of course, evolved into the One Ring at the heart of The Lord of the Rings. This has led many to believe that Tolkien could have been inspired, even subconsciously, by the story of Sylvianus's cursed ring. Tolkien never stated outright that the Ring of Sylvianus was the model for his One Ring. In fact, despite his extremely voluminous writings in both the academic and fictional context, Tolkien never once mentioned the Ring of Sylvianus. Still, we know that in 1929 he came into contact with information regarding the Lydney Temple site and the mysteries surrounding it. While there's no doubt that it wasn't directly stated as an inspiration for the One Ring, it's not hard to see how this story may have served as an unconscious influence on the concept.